The train cut across the endless Texas plain like a rusted serpent under the burning sun. Inside its worn wooden cars, rows of German women sat in silence. Their uniforms, once symbols of duty, had become threadbare reminders of defeat. Dust filtered through the slats, coating their faces in a fine red film. Outside, American soldiers rode alongside in open trucks, rifles resting loosely in their arms. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. For weeks these women had been moved across the American South, first Louisiana, then westward, told only that they were to work. Many imagined the worst. Endless rows of trenches, back-breaking labor in the heat, punishment for the war they had served. The propaganda they had known painted Americans as cruel victors. Yet when the train screeched to a halt and the doors swung open, what awaited them was not barbed wire and barking guards, but a wide-open range. A wind swept across the prairie. It carried with it the smell of mesquite and cattle, of earth and grass, of a world alive. A man in a worn Stetson hat, his skin weathered by the sun, stood beside a battered pickup truck. He tipped his hat toward them, his voice calm and steady. "Welcome to Texas," he said. "You will help us with the cattle." For a moment, the women simply stared, uncertain if they had understood correctly. Cattle? Not trenches, not barracks, not punishment. Just work. Real, open-air work under the endless American sky. The war in Europe felt impossibly far away now. They were prisoners of war, yes. But as the wind swept across that golden field, many of them felt the faintest echo of something they had not known for years. Freedom. That first night, they were taken to their quarters. Simple wooden cabins, near a small cattle ranch outside the town of Hereford, Texas. It was quiet, almost eerily so. The guards were few, and their demeanor lacked hostility. The women were issued clean work clothes and straw hats to shield them from the sun. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all. Others remained suspicious. The next morning, instead of shovels and wheelbarrows, they were handed ropes, gloves, and leather boots. The foreman, a tall cowboy with a calm drawl, taught them how to corral a calf, how to lead a horse, how to mend a fence. The work was difficult, but honest. The women had been prepared for humiliation. Instead, they found dignity. At first, they resisted emotionally. Years of war had hardened them. They had seen cities turn to ash, families torn apart. Many had lost husbands or brothers on the Eastern Front. Yet, as days passed into weeks, something began to shift. The Americans did not speak to them as enemies. They spoke to them as workers, as fellow human beings. Each evening, as the sun sank into the horizon and the sky turned crimson, the women would sit outside their cabins. They would listen to the faint sound of guitars drifting from the main house. The men sang songs of home and love, of loss and longing. The language was foreign, but the meaning was not. By 1944, the United States held over 400,000 German prisoners of war across the country. Texas, with its vast spaces and agricultural needs, became home to dozens of POW camps. Most were built quickly, clusters of barracks surrounded by fences, and served both as internment and labor facilities. Yet within the boundaries of the Geneva Convention, American authorities allowed prisoners to work, not as punishment, but as a means to contribute to local industries strained by the absence of young American men fighting overseas. The women who arrived in Hereford were part of a lesser-known group, female auxiliaries and nurses captured in North Africa and later in Europe. Their transfer to Texas was the result of logistical necessity. Labor was needed, and these women were capable, organized, and accustomed to hard work. The American War Department saw no reason to treat them differently from male POWs. They were placed under military oversight, but were largely integrated into the rhythms of rural life. Local ranchers were skeptical at first. The idea of German women helping on a Texas cattle ranch seemed almost absurd, yet wartime shortages left them little choice. Herding cattle, mending fences, and maintaining ranch operations required hands, and the prisoners provided them. For the women, the camp represented a strange kind of exile. They were far from home, surrounded by a language they did not speak, in a land that felt endless and wild. But it was not cruel. In a world torn apart by destruction, Texas was a place untouched by bombing raids and artillery fire. The skies were vast, the nights full of stars, and the people, though wary, treated them with a distant kindness that disarmed them more effectively than any weapon. American guards maintained discipline, but their approach differed sharply from what the women had expected. There were rules, but also fairness. There were boundaries, but also respect. Over time, mutual curiosity replaced suspicion. The Texans were fascinated by these stoic, uniformed women from a defeated nation. The Germans, in turn, were astonished by the informality of American life, by the sight of soldiers laughing with civilians, and by the strange blend of freedom and order that seemed to define this new world. It was, in many ways, a living contradiction. A war fought for domination had led them to a land that valued individuality above all else. Each morning began before sunrise. The women were roused by the distant sound of a bell, their small cabins coming alive with quiet movement. They tied back their hair, buttoned their work shirts, and walked across the dew-covered fields toward the stables. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of hay and horses. The work was steady, almost meditative. They learned to guide the cattle gently, to move them as one fluid mass across the pasture. The Texans showed them the art of reading the land, the subtle shifts in wind, the way a herd responded to sound and shadow. At first, their movements were clumsy. They shouted in German, startling the animals. But with time, they adapted, their voices softening, their rhythm aligning with the land itself. During breaks, they would gather beneath the shade of cottonwood trees, passing canteens and sharing quiet laughter. The Americans would sometimes join them, offering biscuits or dried fruit. The language barrier was a source of amusement more than frustration. They gestured, drew symbols in the dirt, piecing together a fragile bridge between two worlds. In the evenings, they worked on small repairs, mending saddles, sewing torn gloves, polishing harnesses. The ranch foreman often walked among them, speaking slowly, patiently teaching them new skills. There was an unspoken trust that grew between them. When storms rolled across the plains, both prisoners and ranchers worked side by side, driving the cattle to shelter, soaked to the bone, but united in purpose. Inside their cabins, life was simple. They cooked from rations, cornmeal, beans, dried vegetables, and sometimes the ranchers brought fresh milk or eggs. One woman, Elsa, a former Red Cross nurse from Hamburg, began organizing small gatherings at night. They sang German folk songs softly, their voices rising through the quiet of the prairie. Some cried, others smiled through their tears. As months passed, the guards began to loosen their presence. Escape was possible, but meaningless. Where could they go? The nearest town was miles away, and the people there would have recognized them instantly. The war that had once seemed so close was now a distant thunder beyond the horizon. Occasionally, newspapers arrived with news from Europe. They read them silently, each name of a destroyed city striking like a hammer. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin. Their homes were ashes. Yet around them, the Texas fields remained green, the cattle grazing as if the world had never gone mad. They began to notice the small kindnesses, a cowboy leaving an extra blanket near the fire, a guard turning his eyes away when they lingered outside past curfew to watch the sunset. a child from the nearby town waving shyly through the fence. War had stripped them of identity. But in this strange land, they began to rediscover it. Not through flags or uniforms, but through work, through humanity, through the quiet understanding that life, even in captivity, could hold meaning. By early 1945, the women of Hereford had changed. The hardness in their faces had softened. They laughed more easily now, spoke fragments of English, and carried themselves not as prisoners, but as people rebuilding something invisible within. Elsa had become a kind of leader among them. She often translated between the Texans and the women, her voice steady and calm. One afternoon, the foreman asked her why the German women worked so diligently, even without constant supervision. She paused for a long moment before answering. "In Germany," she said slowly, "work was for survival. Here, it is for living." The man nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the truth of it. They had begun to help with more than cattle. They assisted in the ranch kitchen, learned to bake bread in American ovens, helped local families mend clothing. The children of the nearby town would sneak to the edge of the camp, curious about the foreign women. Soon, laughter echoed over the fence as they taught one another words in both languages. There was no forgetting the war. Some of the women received letters that shattered them. Husbands lost, families gone, homes reduced to rubble. The prairie became their refuge, its vastness a balm against grief. At night, Elsa often sat alone, watching the stars. She would remember her brother, who had gone east to fight and never returned. In those moments, she understood something profound. That she had been raised to believe strength was power, but true strength was compassion. The Texans, with their quiet dignity and simple kindness, had shown her that. By spring, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The women felt it in the air. The guards spoke in hushed tones. Radio reports hinted at collapse. And yet, for many of them, the thought of returning home brought no joy, only uncertainty. Home was no longer the place they had left. On a clear morning in May 1945, the camp awoke to the sound of the radio. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. For a moment there was silence. No cheers, no tears, only the wind moving through the grass. The women stood still, their hands trembling. The foreman removed his hat, lowering his head. Even the guards seemed subdued. Freedom, when it came, felt heavy. They had waited for it, dreamed of it. But now that it was real, it carried the weight of all they had lost. That evening, the Texans held a small gathering. They cooked a meal, simple but generous, and invited the women to sit with them. There were no speeches, only shared silence, the kind that spoke of respect. A young cowboy took out his guitar and played a slow tune. One of the women began to hum along. When the song ended, Elsa rose to her feet. She looked across the table, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have shown us the heart of your country. It is something I will carry home." The Americans nodded. Words were unnecessary. They understood. The following week the camp began to close. Trucks arrived to take the women to the port, where ships waited to carry them back across the ocean. The ranchers stood by the gates as they departed, hats over their hearts. The women waved until the fields disappeared from view. For many, that Texas sky was the last place they had ever felt peace. The voyage back to Europe was long and silent. The women stood on the ship's deck, watching the ocean stretch endlessly beneath them. When they arrived, they did not recognize their homeland. Germany was a land of ruins. Cities they once knew were now piles of stone and twisted metal. The air smelled of ash and defeat. Elsa returned to Hamburg to find her family home destroyed. She wandered the streets, past the husks of buildings and hollow-eyed survivors. Everywhere there was grief. Yet within her, something remained unbroken. A quiet strength forged in the open plains of Texas. In the months that followed, she began to work as a nurse again, this time in a makeshift clinic for refugees. She treated both former soldiers and civilians, refusing to ask which side they had served. To her, they were simply people in pain. Some of the women from Hereford reunited through letters. They shared memories of the ranch, the warmth of the sun, the laughter of the cowboys, the strange comfort of those endless skies. The letters spoke of gratitude, of how captivity had become a classroom for humanity. Years passed. Elsa married, raised children, and never returned to America. But when her daughter once asked her what it was like to be a prisoner, she smiled faintly and said, "It was where I learned that even in defeat, there can be grace." In Texas, the ranch that had once hosted the German women continued its work. The old foreman often spoke of them to his grandchildren. How polite they were, how hard they worked, how war had made enemies of people who might otherwise have been friends. He would pause, look out over the fields and whisper, "They were just people, same as us." Time carried their story into quiet obscurity. Yet in small ways it lived on. Through letters kept in drawers, through songs remembered by heart, through the memory of strangers who had shared a moment of peace amid a world on fire. War reduces nations to symbols, enemy and ally, right and wrong. But beyond the banners and the battlefields are human hearts, capable of mercy even in the darkest hours. The German women who found themselves herding cattle under the Texas sun did not expect kindness. They had been trained to see the world in absolutes. Yet on those wide plains, they discovered that dignity does not belong to victors or vanquished. It belongs to all who choose compassion over cruelty. The Texans, too, learned something. They had been told their prisoners were the enemy. But when they saw them working, laughing, and mourning, they realized that the line between foe and friend was far thinner than they had believed. In the end, their story is not about war, but about what remains when war is stripped away. The simple humanity that endures beneath the uniform, the flag and the fear. Under the same sun that once rose over the camp in Hereford, cattle still graze, the wind still moves through the grass, and the echoes of that strange, fleeting peace still linger. A reminder that even in the shadow of conflict, there can be understanding, and sometimes the truest victories are the quiet ones, won not with weapons but with kindness.